"I can try," Billy said. "But we need to get him somewhere clean, somewhere warm. My place is about half a mile through the trees." Maria looked uncertain. "You live alone?" "Yes." "Why are you help us?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his face. "Most white men, they see Apache, they ride away. Or worse." Billy was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the blood seeping between her fingers. The honest answer was complicated, tangled up with his own isolation and the memories that haunted his bandaged reflection. But there was a simpler truth. Underneath it all, "Because he's hurt," Billy said finally. "Because you asked, because it's the right thing to do." Maria studied him for another moment, then nodded. "How we move him?" "He very weak." Billy looked around and spotted a solution. The cottonwood trees had dropped their leaves early this year, leaving the ground carpeted with large, flexible pieces that could be woven together. In the army, he'd seen men carry wounded soldiers on makeshift litters built from branches and whatever cloth was available. "We make a stretcher," he said, standing and beginning to gather fallen branches of the right length and thickness. "Like a travois, but we carry it." Maria watched him work, still maintaining pressure on her father's wounds, but following his movements with intelligent eyes. When he began stripping his outer shirt to provide cloth for binding the branches together, she stopped him. "Wait," she said. She lifted the hem of her buckskin dress, revealing a cotton underskirt, and tore off a long strip of fabric. "Use this, you need a shirt." Billy accepted the cloth, noting how she'd been careful not to stare at his bandaged face during the exchange. Most people couldn't help themselves. They'd sneak glances when they thought he wasn't looking, or stare openly with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Maria looked at him directly when she spoke, then focused on the task at hand without making him feel like a curiosity dot. It took 15 minutes to build a serviceable stretcher from cottonwood branches and strips of cotton. Billy tested it with his own weight first, making sure the bindings would hold, then positioned it beside Joseph Running Bear. Moving the wounded man would be painful and potentially dangerous, but leaving him beside the creek would almost certainly be fatal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I can try," Billy said. "But we need to get him somewhere clean, somewhere warm. My place is about half a mile through the trees." Maria looked uncertain. "You live alone?" "Yes." "Why are you help us?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his face. "Most white men, they see Apache, they ride away. Or worse." Billy was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the blood seeping between her fingers. The honest answer was complicated, tangled up with his own isolation and the memories that haunted his bandaged reflection. But there was a simpler truth. Underneath it all, "Because he's hurt," Billy said finally. "Because you asked, because it's the right thing to do." Maria studied him for another moment, then nodded. "How we move him?" "He very weak." Billy looked around and spotted a solution. The cottonwood trees had dropped their leaves early this year, leaving the ground carpeted with large, flexible pieces that could be woven together. In the army, he'd seen men carry wounded soldiers on makeshift litters built from branches and whatever cloth was available. "We make a stretcher," he said, standing and beginning to gather fallen branches of the right length and thickness. "Like a travois, but we carry it." Maria watched him work, still maintaining pressure on her father's wounds, but following his movements with intelligent eyes. When he began stripping his outer shirt to provide cloth for binding the branches together, she stopped him. "Wait," she said. She lifted the hem of her buckskin dress, revealing a cotton underskirt, and tore off a long strip of fabric. "Use this, you need a shirt." Billy accepted the cloth, noting how she'd been careful not to stare at his bandaged face during the exchange. Most people couldn't help themselves. They'd sneak glances when they thought he wasn't looking, or stare openly with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Maria looked at him directly when she spoke, then focused on the task at hand without making him feel like a curiosity. It took 15 minutes to build a serviceable stretcher from cottonwood branches and strips of cotton. Billy tested it with his own weight first, making sure the bindings would hold, then positioned it beside Joseph Running Bear. Moving the wounded man would be painful and potentially dangerous, but leaving him beside the creek would almost certainly be fatal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On 3, Billy said, positioning his hands under the man's shoulders while Maria took his legs. 1, 2. Joseph Running Bear cried out once as they lifted him, a sharp sound of pain that cut through the morning air, but then he bit down on whatever noise wanted to follow and endured the transfer in stoic silence. Maria counted something under her breath in Apache, probably a prayer, as they settled her father on the makeshift stretcher. The walk back to Billy's homestead was slow and careful. They had to stop twice to rest and check that the improvised stretcher wasn't coming apart under the weight. Both times, Maria used the pause to check her father's pulse and breathing, her face growing more worried with each inspection. "How long since you ate?" Billy asked during the second rest stop, noting the drawn look around her eyes. "Yesterday morning," Maria replied. "We travel fast when men chase us." "No time to hunt," Billy nodded. Exhaustion and hunger would make everything harder for her, and he suspected she'd been caring for her father's wounds for hours before he'd found them. When they reached his cabin, food would be as important as medical supplies. His homestead came into view as they crested the small rise beyond the cottonwood grove. It wasn't much to look at. A single-room log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn, and a corral that currently held only his bay gelding. But the structure was solid, built to last by his grandfather's careful hands, and more importantly, it was private. Billy had positioned the stretcher so that Maria was walking backward, guiding their path while he handled the front. It meant she saw his homestead first, and he watched her take in the details. The neat vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter. The well-maintained fence lines. The small pile of split firewood stacked against the cabin wall. Her expression suggested approval, or at least relief that they weren't bringing her father to some ramshackle shelter. "You live good here," she said as they approached the cabin door. "Quiet place." "That's the idea," Billy replied, then immediately wished he'd phrased it differently. It sounded like he was trying to convince her he was some kind of hermit, which wasn't entirely wrong but wasn't something he particularly wanted to advertise. They maneuvered the stretcher through the cabin door carefully, Billy walking backward, now to guide them around the sparse furniture. The interior was clean but basic. A bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a wood stove for cooking, and shelves lined with canned goods and basic supplies. A rifle hung on pegs above the door, and a few books sat stacked on the windowsill. "We put him on the bed?" Maria asked. Billy hesitated. The bed was his only real piece of furniture, and once they moved Joseph Running Bear there, Billy would be sleeping on the floor for however long the situation lasted. But the alternative was trying to treat gunshot wounds with the patient lying on the rough wooden floor, which seemed both impractical and cruel. Yes, he decided. Bed is best. They transferred Joseph from the stretcher to the bed as gently as possible, but the wounded man still gasped with pain as they positioned him. Maria immediately went to work examining the wounds more closely in the better light of the cabin interior. Billy busied himself lighting the stove and putting water on to boil, both for cleaning wounds and for coffee, which they were both going to need. "Bullets still inside?" Maria asked, probing gently around the lower wound. Billy came over to look, careful to position himself so that his bandaged profile was turned away from her. The entry wound was clean but deep, and there was no corresponding exit hole. The bullet was lodged somewhere in Joseph's torso, probably near vital organs, and trying to remove it without proper surgical tools would be extremely dangerous. "Yes," Billy said, "but I don't think we should try to dig it out. Too risky without a real doctor." Maria nodded, her expression grim but unsurprised. "In my people's way, we clean wounds, stop bleeding, let the body heal around the bullet if it must. Sometimes it works." "Sometimes? Sometimes," she repeated, meeting his eyes directly. "But my father is strong. He survived worse things." Billy found himself studying her face as she spoke. There was something in her features, in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze, that reminded him of the career soldiers he'd served with. People who had seen enough hardship to understand that hope and realism weren't mutually exclusive. You could acknowledge that the odds were bad while still fighting with everything you had. The water began to boil, and Billy used it to fill a basin for cleaning the wounds. Maria had already torn more strips from her underskirt for bandages, and she worked with practiced efficiency to clear away the dried blood and assess the damage more precisely. "You'd done this before," Billy observed. "Many times," Maria said without looking up from her work. "War teaches everyone to heal, even women, even children." She paused in her cleaning to look at him directly. "You too. Your bandages you change them yourself, very neat." Billy's hand moved involuntarily to his face, adjusting the cloth that covered his scars. "Army teaches you to take care of yourself. What happened?" Maria asked quietly, then immediately seemed to regret the question. "Sorry, not my business." "Ammunition explosion," Billy said after a moment. "Fort Washuka. 18 months ago." Maria nodded once, filing away the information, then returned to cleaning her father's wounds. Billy appreciated that she didn't offer sympathy or ask follow-up questions. In his experience, people either wanted to know all the gruesome details, or they wanted to pretend his injuries didn't exist. Maria seemed content to acknowledge the facts and move on to more pressing matters. Working together, they cleaned both wounds thoroughly and packed them with clean cloth to slow the bleeding. The shoulder wound responded well to the treatment, but the deeper injury continued to seep blood at a troubling rate. Joseph Running Bear remained conscious throughout the process, though his breathing was shallow and his skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor. "He needs rest," Maria said, settling a blanket over her father, "and food when he can eat." "What about you?" Billy asked. "When did you last sleep?" Maria's tired smile suggested the question was almost funny. "Sleep when father is safe. Maybe tomorrow." Billy understood the feeling. During his recovery at the fort, he'd learned that worry could keep you awake far longer than you'd think possible. But he also knew that exhaustion led to poor decisions, and poor decisions could be fatal in situations like this. "I'll watch him," Billy offered. "You rest. I'll wake you if anything changes." Maria looked uncertain. "You sure? You don't know." "Me? Don't know us. I know enough," Billy said. "I know you've been caring for him alone for hours. I know you're exhausted. And I know he'll heal better if you're strong enough to help him." She considered this for a long moment, looking back and forth between Billy and her father. Finally, she nodded. "Maybe 1-2 hours. You wake me, I'll wake you." Maria settled herself in one of the wooden chairs, positioning it so she could see both her father and the cabin door. Even exhausted, she was thinking tactically, Billy noted. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Though she remained upright and alert enough to wake at any sudden sound, Billy sat in the other chair and watched over both of them as the afternoon sunlight slanted through the cabin windows. This wasn't what he'd expected when he woke up that morning. Hell, it wasn't anything he'd expected when he decided to isolate himself on this remote homestead. But as he looked at Joseph Running Bear's pale but steady breathing, at Maria's finally peaceful face, he realized something had shifted in the careful routine of his solitary life. For the first time in 18 months, he wasn't alone with his thoughts and his scars. For the first time since the explosion, someone needed him for something other than his ability to stay out of the way. And despite the uncertainty of what would come next, despite the complications the situation might bring, Billy Morrison found himself grateful for the change. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows and reminding him that winter was coming early this year. But inside, the fire crackled warmly, and two people trusted him enough to sleep under his roof. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but as he adjusted his bandages and settled in for what promised to be a long night of watching, Billy realized it was a responsibility he was ready to accept. The first consequence of Billy's decision revealed itself at dawn. Maria woke as the first pale light crept through the cabin windows, her hand moving instinctively to check her father's pulse before her eyes were fully open. Joseph Running Bear's breathing had steadied during the night, and his color had improved slightly, but the deeper wound continued its slow seepage despite their efforts. Billy had dozed fitfully in his chair, waking every hour to check on his patients and feed the fire. His neck ached from the awkward position, and his bandages had loosened again during the night. He was adjusting them when Maria stirred, and for a moment their eyes met in the gray morning light before he could turn away. "How long you wear bandages?" Maria asked quietly, her voice still thick with sleep. The question caught Billy off guard. Most people either stared or deliberately avoided looking at his covered face. No one had ever asked such a direct question about the practicalities of his situation. "Year and half," he replied, his fingers still working to tighten the cloth strips. "Since the explosion." Maria nodded thoughtfully. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the landscape that was slowly taking shape in the dawnlight. "You change them often?" "Every few days. Have to keep them clean." "Must be difficult," she said, not with pity but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood practical challenges. "Hard to see sometimes, yes? When will they slip?" Billy paused in his adjustments. It was true, the bandages occasionally shifted enough to partially block his vision, especially when he was working or moving quickly. He'd learned to adjust them without thinking about it, but he was surprised that Maria had noticed such a detail. "Sometimes," he admitted. "My grandmother, she lose eye in a riding accident when she was young," Maria said, still looking out the window. "She say hardest part is not seeing. Hardest part is the way people look at you after, like you are a different person." Billy felt something tighten in his chest. In 18 months of isolation, no one had put into words what he'd been feeling so precisely. The army doctors had focused on the physical damage, the pain, and the scarring. His fellow soldiers had either avoided him entirely or treated him with the kind of careful politeness reserved for the permanently disabled. But Maria was the first person to understand that the real wound wasn't what the explosion had done to his face. It was what it had done to his place in the world. She still rode horses? Billy asked. "Until she die at 92, Maria smiled. "She say horses don't care what you look like. Only care if you are good to them." The conversation was interrupted by a low groan from the bed. Joseph Running Bear was waking up, his eyes blinking slowly as consciousness returned. Maria immediately moved to his side, speaking softly in Apache while checking the bandages they'd applied the night before. Billy approached more cautiously, positioning himself so his bandaged face was turned away. In the clearer morning light, Joseph's wounds looked better than they had by firelight. The shoulder injury had stopped bleeding entirely, and while the deeper wound still seeped, the flow had slowed considerably. "How do you feel, Father?" Maria asked in English, apparently for Billy's benefit. Joseph's response came in Apache, but his tone suggested he was in significant pain, though trying not to show it. He attempted to sit up, winced, and allowed Maria to guide him back down to the pillow. "He want to know if we are safe here," Maria translated. "He worry about the men who shoot us." Billy considered this. The riders who had attacked Joseph and Maria would have no reason to track them to this isolated homestead, but they might return to the creek area if they thought they'd left witnesses alive. More concerning was the possibility that someone might come looking for the missing Apache pair, either friends searching for them or authorities investigating the shooting. "We're safe for now," Billy said, "but he's right to be concerned. People will notice you're missing eventually." Maria translated this for her father, who responded with what sounded like a question. She nodded and turned back to Billy. "He asked what you want for helping us. What payment?" Billy was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was that he hadn't thought about payment at all. The decision to help had been instinctive, driven by the same impulses that had made him a good soldier. You helped people in trouble because it was what decent people did. But he understood why Joseph would ask. In a territory where Apache families were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility, unexpected kindness usually came with a price. "Nothing," Billy said finally. "Just want to see him get well." Joseph studied Billy's face intently as Maria translated, his dark eyes sharp despite his physical weakness. He said something else in Apache, longer this time, and Maria's expression grew thoughtful as she listened. "My father say you are a wounded warrior like him," she translated. "He say wounded warriors must help each other, because others don't understand the weight of carrying damage." She paused. "He want to know if you carry your wounds alone." The question hit deeper than Billy had expected. The physical answer was obvious. Yes, he'd been managing his injuries and his isolation by himself for 18 months. But Joseph's meaning went beyond practical concerns. He was asking if Billy had anyone who understood what it meant to be forever changed by violence. Anyone who could share the particular burden of being marked by war. "Yes," Billy said quietly, "alone." Joseph nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. He spoke again, his voice gaining strength, and gestured toward the bandages covering Billy's face. "He say you hide from the world because the world turn away from scars," Maria translated. "But scars just proof you survived something others couldn't. He say hiding makes wounds deeper, not smaller." Billy felt heat rise in his face beneath the bandages. There was truth in Joseph's words that made him uncomfortable. He'd told himself that his isolation was practical, that he was simply avoiding the stares and whispered comments that followed him in town. But if he was honest, there was more to it than that. Somewhere along the way, he'd started to believe that his scarred face made him someone different, someone fundamentally damaged and separate from the rest of humanity. "Easy to say," Billy replied, his voice tighter than he'd intended. "Harder to live with people looking at you like you're something broken." Joseph said something else, and this time Maria hesitated before translating. He say maybe the problem is not that you broken. Maybe the problem is that you let other people decide what broken means. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that Billy wasn't ready to examine closely. He turned away from the bed, ostensibly to check the fire, but really to avoid the penetrating gaze of the wounded Apache man who seemed to see through his carefully constructed defenses. "He needs food," Billy said, changing the subject. "Broth maybe, something easy to keep down." Maria recognized the deflection but didn't push. "Yes, and water. Lots of water." Billy busied himself preparing a simple beef broth from dried meat and vegetables, grateful for the familiar routine of cooking. As he worked, he became aware that Maria was moving around the cabin, examining his possessions with the careful attention of someone assessing a potential threat or ally. She paused at the rifle mounted above the door, noting its condition and placement. She looked at the books on the windowsill, running her finger along their spines, though Billy suspected she couldn't read the titles. She studied the few personal items he'd kept from his army days: a brass compass, a leather-bound journal, a photograph of his unit that he kept face down on the shelf. "You read much?" she asked, picking up one of the books. "Some," Helps pass the time. What is this one? She held up a thick volume with a worn cover. Billy glanced over and recognized it as his copy of Whitman's poetry, one of the few books he'd brought from the fort. Poems, Walt Whitman. Maria's eyebrows rose with interest. You read poems to yourself? Sometimes. Billy felt self-conscious about admitting it, but there was something about Maria's genuine curiosity that made honesty feel safer than deflection. This one has poems about war, about soldiers. Helps me think through ... things. Read one? She asked, settling back into her chair beside her father's bed. Billy stopped stirring the broth. Now? Fathers sleep better with voices. Peaceful sounds. She gestured toward Joseph, who had indeed dozed off again. In the Apache way, we tell stories to help sick people heal. Maybe poems work the same way. Billy considered this request. He hadn't read aloud to anyone since before the explosion, when he'd occasionally entertained fellow soldiers around campfires. The bandages changed the sound of his voice, making it slightly muffled, and he'd become self-conscious about how he sounded to others. But there was something compelling about Maria's suggestion. The cabin had been so quiet for so long, filled only with the sounds of solitary living. The idea of adding human voices, of creating something peaceful for Joseph's recovery, appealed to him in a way he hadn't expected. He retrieved the book from the shelf and opened it to a page he knew well. The poem was called The Wound Dresser, and it spoke of tending to injured soldiers during the Civil War. Billy had read it dozens of times during his own recovery, finding comfort in Whitman's understanding of both physical and emotional wounds. From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, Billy read, his voice quiet but clear. I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough, wash off the matter and blood, ... single quotes. As he continued reading, Billy became aware that the quality of silence in the cabin had changed. Joseph's breathing seemed to deepen and settle into a more restful rhythm. Maria listened with the focused attention of someone hearing English poetry for the first time, following the cadences even when individual words were unfamiliar. When he finished, Maria was quiet for a long moment. Beautiful, she said finally. Sad but beautiful. Like prayer for hurt people. That's exactly what it is, Billy realized, speaking the thought aloud as it occurred to him. A prayer for people who carry wounds. You carry this book long time? Maria asked. Since the hospital. Doctor there said reading might help with the thinking through what happened. Did it help? Billy considered the question honestly. Some. Made me feel less alone, anyway. Maria nodded thoughtfully. Apache people, we have healing songs. Different songs for different kinds of hurt. Maybe all people need words to help carry pain. The broth was ready, and Billy ladled it into a cup, testing the temperature before bringing it to the bedside. Joseph woke as they helped him sit up enough to drink, and though he was clearly still weak, he managed to take several sips of the warm liquid. As Joseph drank, Billy found himself watching Maria's face. She had the weathered look of someone who spent most of her time outdoors, but there was something else in her features that he was beginning to recognize. Intelligence, certainly, but more than that. A kind of careful wisdom that came from navigating a world that wasn't always welcoming to people like her. Maria, Billy said, the question forming as he spoke, how many times have you done this? Helped someone heal from bullet wounds? Her expression grew somber. Too many times. My people, we learn early that doctors in white towns don't always help Apache. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they turn away. Sometimes worse. She adjusted her father's pillow, so we learn to help ourselves. Women especially. Men go fight. Women learn to fix what fighting breaks. Where did you learn? About medicine, I mean. My grandmother, same one with missing eye. She was healer for our band. Taught me plants, taught me how to clean wounds, how to set bones. Maria's voice carried pride mixed with sadness. She say, healing is gift from spirits, but also hard work. Have to study, have to practice. Can't just hope and pray. Billy absorbed this information, realizing he'd made assumptions about Maria's knowledge based on his limited understanding of Apache culture. She wasn't just a desperate daughter trying to save her father. She was a trained healer who understood medicine in ways that complemented but differed from his own army field training. The bullet in his chest, Billy said. In your grandmother's teaching, would you try to remove it? Maria was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options. Depends, where exactly it lodge, how deep, if it move when he breathe. She gently probed the area around Joseph's wound, feeling for the metal beneath his skin. I think it'd sit against the rib bone maybe. Not moving toward the heart or lung. Better to leave, let the body heal around it. You're sure? Not sure. But more sure than if we try to cut it out with no proper tools. She met his eyes directly. In war, sometimes you choose between bad choice and worse choice. This feels like bad choice that might work. Billy understood that kind of decision-making intimately. In battle, you often had to act on incomplete information, weighing terrible risks against potentially worse outcomes. The fact that Maria could think that clearly under pressure told him something important about her character. Joseph spoke again, his voice stronger after the broth. Maria listened, then smiled for the first time since Billy had met her. He say broth is good. He say thank you for sharing food with strangers. She paused. He also say he think you good man with sad eyes, and he hope we can help you too while we are here. The comment caught Billy off guard. Help me? Father see things, Maria said gently. He say you live like a man in exile, but exile is punishment. He wonder what you punish yourself for. Billy felt exposed by the observation, as if Joseph running bare could see through his bandages and his carefully constructed isolation to something he'd been hiding even from himself. I'm not punishing myself for anything, I just prefer privacy. Maybe, Maria said, but her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe it. Or maybe you punish yourself for surviving when others didn't. Fathers say that is common with warriors. They feel guilty for coming home when friends stay on the ground. The words hit close enough to the truth that Billy had to turn away from the bed again. There had been other soldiers in the ammunition depot when the explosion happened. Private Henderson had died instantly. Sergeant Walsh had lingered for 3 days before succumbing to his burns. Billy had been thrown clear by the blast, scarred but alive, and some part of him had never stopped wondering why he'd been the one to walk away. It's not that simple, he said finally. No, Maria agreed, never simple. But maybe not as complicated as you make it either. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Billy immediately moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. 3 riders were coming up the path from the main trail, moving at a steady but unhurried pace. Even at a distance, he could see they were white men, armed, and heading directly for his homestead. We have visitors, Billy announced, his hand moving instinctively to check his sidearm. Maria joined him at the window, taking in the approaching riders with a practiced eye. Not the same men who shoot us, she said after a moment. Different. Horses, different way of sitting saddle. But they're looking for something, Billy observed. People don't just wander out here by accident. Joseph had heard the conversation and was struggling to sit up in bed, clearly preparing to fight or flee despite his wounds. Maria spoke to him in Apache, probably telling him to conserve his strength, but her own posture had grown alert and defensive. You know these men? She asked Billy. Billy studied the riders more carefully as they drew closer. He recognized the lead horse, a distinctive paint with white markings, and his stomach sank as he identified the rider. The one in front is Deputy Marshal Carter from Tombstone, Billy said grimly. The others look like territorial rangers or maybe cavalry from the fort. They come for us? Maria asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Most likely. Billy watched the riders approach his cabin, noting how they spread out slightly as they got closer, positioning themselves to cover multiple escape routes. Someone probably reported the shooting yesterday, and they're tracking you. The first real consequence of Billy's choice to help was about to arrive at his front door. He'd known this moment might come, but in the peaceful quiet of the morning routine, he'd allowed himself to hope they might have more time. Now, as Deputy Marshal Carter dismounted and approached the cabin with his hand resting on his gun butt, Billy realized that helping Maria and Joseph had pulled him back into a world he'd been trying to escape. But as he looked at the determination in Maria's eyes, at Joseph struggling to prepare himself for whatever came next despite his wounds, Billy found that he wasn't sorry for the choice he'd made. Whatever happened next, he'd acted according to his principles rather than his fears. And for the first time in 18 months, that distinction felt like it might matter more than the consequences. Deputy Marshal Carter knocked 3 times, sharp and authoritative. Billy opened the door slowly, keeping his body positioned to block the view inside while his hand remained near his sidearm. Carter was a lean man in his 40s with a graying mustache and eyes that missed nothing. Behind him stood 2 younger men Billy didn't recognize, one wearing cavalry blues, the other in the rough clothing of a territorial ranger. "Morning, Morrison," Carter said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mind if we come in? Got some questions that need asking." "Depends on the questions," Billy replied, not moving from the doorway. Carter's expression hardened slightly. "Had a shooting yesterday about 15 miles north of here. Apache man and woman involved. Tracking suggests they headed this direction." His eyes took in Billy's bandaged face without obvious reaction. "You see anything unusual yesterday?" "Here. Any gunshots?" Billy felt Maria's presence behind him, just out of sight, but close enough to hear every word. Joseph would be listening too, probably preparing himself for capture despite his wounds. The weight of their trust pressed against Billy's shoulders like a physical thing. "I heard shots," Billy said carefully. "Sounded like it came from the creek area. Didn't investigate." "Smart man," the cavalry soldier said with a slight sneer. "Apache trouble ain't something civilians should mess with." Carter shot his companion a warning look, then returned his attention to Billy. "Thing is, we've been tracking since dawn. Trail leads right past your property. 2 sets of prints, one of them bleeding pretty steady." He paused meaningfully. "Now I know you keep to yourself out here, but harboring fugitives is a federal offense." "Fugitives from what?" Billy asked, though he kept his voice level. "Cattle theft," the ranger spoke up. 3 ranchers reported missing stock. Found Apache tracks near the scene. Billy studied the ranger's face, noting the eager way he gripped his rifle and the way his eyes darted around the homestead as if expecting an ambush. This man wanted trouble, wanted an excuse to use the weapons he carried. It was a type Billy recognized from his army days, men who joined up not from patriotism or necessity, but from a desire to hurt people with legal justification. "Tracks don't prove theft," Billy observed. "Don't prove innocence either," Carter replied. "Look, Morrison, I know you've had a rough time of it since your injury. Nobody's questioning your service or your character. But if you're hiding someone here, it's going to go hard for all of you." The words carried both threat and promise. Carter was offering Billy a way out. Claim ignorance, step aside. Let them search the cabin and arrest Maria and Joseph. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice for a man trying to avoid complications in his carefully ordered isolation. Billy looked at the 3 armed men on his porch, then thought about Maria's hands pressed against her father's bleeding wounds, about Joseph's words regarding wounded warriors helping each other, about the trust they'd placed in him despite barely knowing him. "I haven't seen any Apache," Billy said finally. "But you're welcome to look around the property if you think it's necessary." It wasn't quite a lie. He was offering to let them search the grounds, not the cabin. But Carter seemed to interpret it as cooperation, and his posture relaxed slightly. "Appreciate it," Carter said. "Boys, check the barn and corral. I'll take a look at the creek area where Morrison heard the shots." As the other two men moved toward the outbuildings, Carter lingered on the porch. "Can I ask you something personal, Morrison?" Billy tensed. "Go ahead." "You ever think about coming back to town? I mean regular like, not just for supplies." Carter's voice carried what might have been genuine concern. "Man gets too isolated out here, starts thinking strange thoughts, starts seeing the world different than it really is." "And how is the world really?" Billy asked. "Complicated," Carter admitted. "But there's right and wrong, and there's law and order. Apache have been raiding settlements for generations. Some of them are peaceful now, sure, but others ... He shrugged. "Others are still fighting the same war they've been fighting since before you and I were born." Billy absorbed this perspective, recognizing the grain of truth buried in Carter's oversimplification. There were indeed Apache bands that continued to resist territorial authority through violence. But there were also Apache families trying to live peacefully on reservation land or in small communities. Families like Joseph and Maria who became convenient scapegoats when actual raiders proved too difficult to catch. "The people you're tracking," Billy said. "You know for certain they stole cattle?" Carter was quiet for a moment, studying Billy's bandaged face as if trying to read something in the visible portion of his expression. "Know for certain?" "No. But 3 ranchers say stock went missing, and Apache tracks were found nearby." "That's enough for an investigation. Investigation or arrest?" "Depends what we find when we catch up to them." Carter's tone suggested the distinction might not matter much. "Look, Morrison, I respect what you did for your country. But this ain't the Army, and these ain't enemy soldiers. This is civilian law enforcement, and it works different." The cavalry soldier returned from checking the barn, shaking his head to indicate he'd found nothing. The ranger emerged from behind the cabin, also empty-handed but looking disappointed about it. "Creek area shows signs of recent activity," Carter called out. "Blood on the rocks, disturbed ground. Looks like someone was hurt pretty bad." He rejoined the group on the porch. "Trail goes cold after that, though. Either they doubled back or ... He let the implication hang in the air. Either the Apache pair had changed direction, or someone had helped them disappear. Billy kept his expression neutral, but he could feel sweat forming beneath his bandages. "Maybe they went to ground somewhere," Billy suggested. "If one of them was wounded badly enough to leave that much blood, they might not have gotten far." "Maybe," Carter agreed, but his eyes remained suspicious. "Or maybe someone with medical experience helped patch them up enough to keep moving." The comment felt like a probe, testing Billy's reaction. Carter clearly knew about Billy's Army background, probably knew he'd have basic field medical training. Billy forced himself to remain still, not to adjust his bandages or shift his weight in ways that might telegraph guilt. "Lot of possibilities," Billy said neutrally. Carter nodded slowly, then made a decision. "Boys, we're going to expand the search pattern. Check the draws and washes within a 5-mile radius. If they're holed up somewhere close, we'll find them." As the 3 men remounted their horses, Carter paused for one final exchange. "Morrison, if you do see anything, Apache or anyone else who doesn't belong, you send word to town immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." "Why would I do that?" Billy asked. "Because," Carter said, his voice carrying new steel, "territorial governors put a bounty on Apache raiders. $50 for information leading to arrest, $100 for capture." He touched his hat brim again. "Some folks might be tempted to try collecting that money personally. Wouldn't end well for anyone involved." The warning was clear. Don't try to be a hero, and don't try to hide fugitives. Billy watched the 3 riders head north toward the creek area, then quickly closed the cabin door and turned back to his patience. Maria emerged from behind the wood stove where she'd been concealed during the conversation. Her face was pale but determined, and she moved immediately to check on her father, who had remained motionless and silent throughout the visit. "They will return," she said quietly, not quite a question. "Yes," Billy agreed, "probably with more men. And they'll search more thoroughly next time." Joseph spoke in Apache, his voice weak but urgent. Maria listened, nodded, then began gathering their few possessions, the torn remnants of her dress, the strips of cloth they'd used for bandages, anything that might indicate Apache presence in the cabin. "Father says we must leave today," Maria translated. "Says we bring danger to you, and you've helped enough." Billy watched her efficient preparations and felt something unexpected, reluctance to see them go. The cabin had felt more alive in the past day than it had in the entire 18 months of his isolation. But beyond his personal feelings, there were practical concerns. "Your father can't travel," Billy pointed out. "Not with that bullet still in him. The movement could shift into something vital." "Better to die moving than die in cage," Maria replied, echoing what was clearly her father's sentiment. "Apache who stay in one place become Apache in chains." "There might be another option," Billy said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "The old mine shaft is about 2 miles east of here. It's hidden in a canyon, got water from an underground spring. Used to be a hideout for claim jumpers and deserters. Nobody's used it for years." Maria paused in her packing. "You know this place? Found it by accident last spring when I was tracking a lost steer. Dry, defensible, hard to find unless you know exactly where to look." Billy moved to the window, checking to make sure Carter and his men were truly gone. "It's not comfortable, but it's safe. And it's close enough that I could bring supplies, check on your father's wounds." "Why do you do this?" Maria asked, her dark eyes searching his face. "Lawmen make it clear, you help us, you become a criminal too." Billy considered the question, trying to articulate something he was still working out for himself. "Because Carter's wrong about right and wrong being simple. Because your father didn't steal any cattle, and you shouldn't be punished for something you didn't do." He paused. "And because 18 months ago, people helped me when I needed it. Maybe it's time I returned the favor." Joseph spoke again, longer this time, and Maria's expression shifted to something Billy couldn't quite read. "Father say you are a good man who forget his own goodness." She translated carefully, as if making sure she had the words. "Right. He say isolation is like infection. It grows and spreads until it poison everything. He say maybe helping us help you remember who you really are." The observation stung because it felt accurate. Billy had begun to define himself entirely by his scars, by his damaged face, and his separation from normal human contact. But in the past day, making decisions about medical care and facing down armed law officers, he'd felt like a soldier again. Not a broken ex-soldier, just a soldier doing what needed to be done. "The mine shaft," Billy said, refocusing on practical matters. "We could move him there tonight, after dark. It'll be painful for him, but safer than staying here." Maria nodded, accepting the plan. "What do we tell lawmen when they come back?" "That I've been thinking about their visit, and I remembered seeing some riders heading east toward the old mining district. Not Apache, just travelers, but maybe worth checking." Billy met her eyes. "It'll send them in the right direction to find the mine area, but there are dozens of old workings over there. They could search for weeks without finding the right one. Dangerous game," Maria observed. "If they discover you lie, then we'll deal with that when it happens." Billy surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. "Right now, keeping your father alive is more important than keeping me out of trouble." Over the next few hours, they refined their plan. Billy would prepare supplies, food, medical materials, blankets, while Maria worked with her father to build his strength for the difficult journey. They would travel by foot after midnight, when the moon was down and the darkness would hide their movement. It meant Billy would be actively deceiving federal law officers, harboring fugitives, and potentially facing serious legal consequences. If caught, a month ago, even a week ago, such risks would have been unthinkable for a man trying to live quietly and avoid complications. But as Billy packed supplies and watched Maria tend to her father's wounds with skillful hands, he realized something fundamental had shifted in his thinking. For 18 months, he'd been so focused on what the explosion had taken from him that he'd forgotten what it had left behind. His sense of duty, his ability to help others, his capacity for making moral choices under pressure, none of that had been damaged by burning gunpowder and flying metal. Carter had been wrong about isolation changing how a man saw the world. Billy's isolation hadn't changed his vision, it had simply narrowed it, focused it entirely inward until he could see nothing but his own wounds. But Maria and Joseph's arrival had forced him to look outward again, to see that there were still people who needed help and still ways he could provide it. The afternoon stretched long and tense as they prepared for the night's journey, each of them aware that they were crossing a line from which there might be no return. But none of them suggested abandoning the plan, and as evening shadows began to lengthen across the homestead, Billy found himself looking forward to the challenge. Ahead rather than dreading it, whatever consequences followed, he would face them as a man who had chosen to act rather than a man who had chosen to hide. And for the first time since the explosion, that felt like a distinction worth making. The moon was a thin crescent when they began the journey to the mine shaft, casting barely enough light to navigate the rocky terrain. Billy had fashioned a makeshift travois from pine branches and canvas, similar to what he'd built at the creek, but sturdier for the longer journey. Joseph, running bare, lay strapped to the contraption, conscious but silent, his jaw clenched against the pain that each jostle brought to his wounds. Maria walked beside her father, one hand resting on his shoulder while her eyes scanned the darkness. Ahead, she'd changed into men's clothing Billy had found in his grandfather's old trunk, worn denim pants and a wool shirt that made her less conspicuous in the moonlight. Her hair was braided tight and hidden under a felt hat, another precaution against being spotted by distant watchers. Billy pulled the travois, grateful for the thick leather gloves that protected his hands from the rough rope handles. The weight wasn't excessive, but the uneven ground made every step treacherous. They couldn't risk using a torch or lantern, so they moved by feel and instinct, stopping frequently to check Joseph's condition and ensure they hadn't lost their way. 2 hours into the journey, disaster struck. Billy was navigating a particularly steep section of the trail when his boot caught on loose shale. He stumbled, the travois tilted sharply, and Joseph cried out as his wounded body was jarred against the rocky ground. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, unnaturally loud in the still night air. "Stop," Maria whispered urgently, dropping to her knees beside her father. "Something is wrong." Billy set down the travois handles and moved to help examine Joseph. Even in the dim light, he could see fresh blood seeping through the bandages over the chest wound. The fall had torn something loose inside, and Joseph's breathing had become rapid and shallow. "The bullet," Maria said, her voice tight with controlled fear. It shifted. Billy felt along Joseph's ribs, trying to assess the damage without causing more pain. There was definite swelling around the wound site, and Joseph's pulse was becoming irregular. The jarring fall had likely moved the bullet closer to vital organs, creating exactly the situation they'd been trying to avoid. "Can we continue?" Billy asked. Maria spoke quietly to her father in Apache. His response was weak but determined, and she nodded grimly. "He says we go on. He says stopping here means dying here, and dying here means you get caught with dead Apache on your land." She looked up at Billy, her eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "He's right. If we turn back now, we all lose everything." Billy understood the calculation. They were committed now, too far from the cabin to retreat safely, and too close to their destination to give up. Joseph would either survive the rest of the journey, or he wouldn't. But stopping in the open would only guarantee failure for everyone involved. They resumed their careful progress, moving even more slowly now, but with a new urgency born of desperation. Billy found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to since the explosion, asking not for miracles but simply for the strength to see this through. Behind him, he could hear Maria whispering what sounded like Apache prayers, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed older than the rocks around them. The mine shaft entrance appeared suddenly, a dark gap in the canyon wall that looked like nothing more than a shadow until they were close enough to feel the cool air flowing from within. Billy had discovered it purely by chance months earlier, following a wounded deer that had sought shelter in the depths. The main tunnel ran back into the hillside for about 50 yards before branching into smaller passages, most of them blocked by cave-ins or flooded with groundwater. But the first chamber was dry and surprisingly spacious, with a natural chimney that drew smoke safely away and a spring that provided fresh water year-round. Someone had used it as a hideout before. There were still remnants of old campsites, rusted cans, and carved initials on the walls. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden and defensible. Getting Joseph down the steep path to the mine entrance required all their combined strength and ingenuity. Maria climbed down first to guide the travois, while Billy lowered it inch by inch using ropes secured around a sturdy pine tree. Every movement caused Joseph fresh agony, but he endured it without complaint, understanding that silence might mean the difference between safety and capture. Inside the mine, Billy quickly built a small fire using dry wood he'd cached there during previous visits. The flickering light revealed a space that was larger than his cabin, with smooth stone walls and a ceiling high enough to stand upright. Maria immediately set about creating a comfortable sleeping area for her father, using blankets and supplies Billy had carried in his pack. "Better," she announced after examining Joseph by firelight. "Bullet will not move more, I think. But he need rest, real rest, for many days." Billy nodded, settling onto a flat stone that served as a crude chair. "He'll have it here. Nobody knows about this place except us." "You sure?" Maria asked, noting the old campsites and carved names. "Whoever used it before is long gone. I've been checking on it for months. No fresh signs, no recent disturbance." Billy fed another piece of wood to the fire. "We should be safe for as long as we need." But even as he said the words, Billy felt the weight of what they'd just committed. T.O. He was now actively harboring fugitives from federal law, had lied to a deputy marshal, and was planning to continue the deception for an indefinite period. There would be no casual return to his isolated homestead, no pretending this had never happened. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Joseph spoke suddenly, his voice weak but clear in the English Billy was surprised to hear. Double quotes you. "Understand. That what are you risk?" he asked, each word carefully formed despite his pain. "I understand some of it," Billy replied honestly. "Prison," Joseph continued, struggling to sit up slightly. "Or worse, white law. Not gentle. With those who help Apache." Billy had seen enough territorial justice to know Joseph was right. Men had been hanged for less than what he was doing now, especially when Apache were involved. The territorial government was still fighting what they called the Apache problem, and anyone who interfered with that effort could expect harsh treatment. "Then why?" Joseph asked, his dark eyes fixed on Billy's bandaged face. "Why did you choose this path?" Billy was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire while he tried to articulate something he was still working out himself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised him. "Because choosing safety over what's right is how good men become cowards," he said. "And I've been a coward long enough." Maria looked up from where she was tending the fire. You are not a coward. You survive terrible thing. You heal yourself. No, Billy shook his head, adjusting his bandages unconsciously. I hid from a terrible thing. There's a difference. He met her eyes directly. Surviving means you keep living after something tries to kill you. I just stopped living where other people could see me do it. Joseph nodded slowly, as if Billy had confirmed something he'd suspected. And now? Now I remember that being alive means making choices that matter, even when they're dangerous. Billy added another piece of wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher, especially when they're dangerous. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all three of them freeze, voices echoing faintly from somewhere outside. The mine. Billy immediately moved to douse the fire, but Maria caught his arm. Wait, she whispered. Listen. They strained to hear through the stone walls. The voices were distant, probably at the top of the canyon rather than near the mine. Entrance. Male voices, at least three of them speaking English. One voice rose above the others, giving what sounded like orders. ... Check every shaft. Tracks have to lead somewhere. Governor wants this wrapped up quick. Billy recognized Deputy Marshal Carter's voice, and his heart sank. They'd been found, or at least the search had extended to the mining district faster than he'd expected. The false information he'd given Carter about seeing riders heading east had worked too well, bringing the law directly to their hiding place. How many ways out? Maria whispered urgently. Billy had explored the mine thoroughly during his previous visits. Main entrance plus 2 back tunnels. One's flooded about 30 feet in, but the other connects to a natural cave system. Comes out about half a mile north of here, but it's a tight squeeze. Father can't crawl through tight spaces, Maria pointed out. I know. Billy was already making calculations, weighing impossible options against worse alternatives. But maybe. He doesn't have to. The voices outside were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of horses picking their way down the rocky canyon floor. Billy could make out at least 4 distinct speakers now, probably more. Carter had brought reinforcements, turning this from a simple search into a full manhunt. Maria, Billy said quietly, can you get your father through that back tunnel if you have to? Maybe. If he stays conscious, if the tunnel is not too narrow. She looked at her wounded father, then back at Billy. But what about you? I'm going out the main entrance, Billy said, surprising himself with the decision even as he made it. Going to tell them I've been exploring the old mines, looking for the Apache trail. Lead them away from here. That's suicide, Maria protested. They catch you helping us, they hang you for sure. Not if they don't catch me helping you. Billy was already moving, gathering his pack and rifle. Not if they just find a concerned citizen who's been doing his own tracking, happened to spot their lights and came to report what he's seen. Joseph struggled to sit up straighter. You ... Walk into a trap ... for us. I walk into a conversation, Billy corrected. One that keeps you both alive and gives you time to heal. It was a desperate plan, full of holes and dependent on Billy's ability to convince armed, suspicious lawmen that his presence in the mine was coincidental rather than incriminating. But it was the only option that didn't end with Joseph dying of his wounds, or all of them being captured. Maria reached out and touched Billy's arm, her fingers gentle against the fabric of his shirt. Why you do this? Really, why? Billy looked at her for a long moment, then at Joseph, who was watching with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. These people had trusted him with their lives, had shown him a kind of acceptance and respect he'd forgotten existed. More than that, they'd reminded him of who he used to be before the explosion had convinced him he was someone different. Because you showed me I'm still a soldier, Billy said simply. And soldiers don't abandon their people. He moved toward the mine entrance, pausing only to make sure his bandages were secure and his story was straight. Behind him, Maria was already helping her father toward the back tunnel, preparing for an escape that might become necessary if Billy's gamble failed. The voices outside were close now, probably within 100 yards of the mine entrance. Billy took a deep breath, stepped out into the darkness, and walked toward whatever consequences awaited a scarred ex-soldier who had finally remembered the difference between hiding from the world and protecting the people who mattered in it. As he climbed toward the canyon floor where Carter and his men were searching, Billy felt something he hadn't experienced since before the explosion. The calm certainty that came from making a choice he could live with, regardless of how it turned out. Win or lose, he was acting like the man he'd always tried to be rather than the damaged recluse he'd allowed himself to become. The point of no return lay behind him now, somewhere in the darkness of the mine where 2 Apache refugees waited to see if their trust in a stranger had been well placed. All that remained was to discover whether courage, once rediscovered, was strong enough to carry him through what came next. Billy emerged from the canyon shadows with his rifle slung casually across his shoulder, calling out to identify himself before the mounted lawmen could mistake him for a threat. 4 torches flickered in the darkness ahead, held by men whose weapons were already drawn at the sound of his approach. "Deputy Carter," Billy called, raising one hand while keeping the other visible on his rifle stock. "It's William Morrison. From the homestead southeast of here. Morrison." Carter's voice carried surprise and suspicion in equal measure. "What in hell are you doing out here at this hour?" Billy walked closer, letting the torchlight illuminate his bandaged face so there could be no question of his identity. The 4 men formed a loose semicircle around him, Carter and the 2 from earlier, plus a new face Billy didn't recognize. All of them looked like they'd been riding hard for hours, their horses lathered and their tempers short. "Been tracking," Billy said, gesturing toward the maze of old mine shafts that pockmarked the canyon walls. "After you left this morning, I got to thinking about those shots I heard. Figured maybe I could pick up a trail, help with your search." The new man, a stocky fellow with sergeant stripes on his cavalry uniform, let out a harsh laugh. "Citizen. Tracking at night, in Apache country? That's either brave or stupid, friend." "Maybe both," Billy admitted, allowing a slight smile to show in his voice. "But I know this area better than most, and I figured you could use local knowledge." Carter studied Billy's face in the flickering torchlight, clearly trying to read something in the visible portions of his expression. "Find anything useful?" Billy had prepared for this moment during his climb from the mine entrance, constructing a story that would sound plausible while steering the search away from Maria and Joseph's hiding place. The key was to give Carter enough useful information to maintain credibility while misdirecting the actual search. "Maybe," Billy said carefully. "Found some interesting tracks about a quarter-mile north of here. Look like they might be headed toward the old Spanish diggings up near Deadman's Ridge." The sergeant leaned forward in his saddle. "Spanish diggings?" "Abandoned. Silver workings from the 1860s, Billy explained. "Honeycombed with tunnels, most of them flooded now. Good place to hide if you knew the layout, but dangerous if you didn't." Carter exchanged glances with his men. "You willing to show us these tracks?" Billy had hoped for exactly this question. Leading them north toward the genuinely abandoned mines would buy Maria and Joseph precious time while keeping the searchers occupied in an area where they wouldn't accidentally stumble across the real hiding place. "Of course," Billy said, "though I should warn you, the terrain up there is treacherous in daylight. At night, it's downright deadly." "We'll manage," Carter replied curtly. "Mount up behind Kowalski there. You can guide us from horseback." As Billy climbed up behind the cavalry sergeant, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. One of the pack horses carried what looked like tracking equipment, surveying chains, measuring rods, and most ominously, several sticks of dynamite. These men weren't just planning to search the mines. They were prepared to blast open any passages they found sealed or blocked. The implications were terrifying. If they decided to dynamite the mine where Maria and Joseph were hiding, the explosion could collapse the entire tunnel system. Even if the refugees escaped through the back passages, they'd be trapped in unfamiliar cave networks, with no supplies and a severely wounded man who might not survive much more movement. Billy forced himself to remain calm as they rode north through the darkness, but his mind raced through increasingly desperate contingencies. He had to keep the search party moving away from the hidden mine for as long as possible, hopefully, until dawn, when Joseph might be strong enough to attempt the dangerous escape route through the flooded tunnels. "Tell me about these Apache we're tracking," Billy said as they navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. "What makes you so sure they're raiders?" Sergeant Kowalski answered without turning around. "Cattle theft, like we told you. Plus, they shot a rancher named Pete Hutchins when he tried to stop them." Billy felt his stomach drop. "Shot him? Is he dead?" "Wounded pretty bad," Carter called back from the lead position. "Doc says he'll probably make it, but it was touch and go for a while. This changed everything." Billy had assumed Maria and Joseph were fleeing from false accusations, innocent victims of territorial prejudice and opportunistic violence. But if someone had actually been shot during a cattle theft, if there was a genuine victim with real injuries, then the moral calculus became far more complicated. "You sure it was these two?" Billy pressed. "I mean, there are a lot of Apache bands moving through the territory. Hutchins got a good look before they shot him." The fourth man spoke up, a bounty hunter by his clothes and equipment. "Man and woman, traveling together. Woman was young, pretty in that savage way. Man was older, gray in his hair." The description matched Joseph and Maria perfectly, and Billy felt a chill of uncertainty creep through his resolve. Had he been harboring genuine criminals? Had his instinctive sympathy for the underdog blinded him to the possibility that they might actually be guilty of the crimes they were accused of? But then he remembered Maria's hands, gentle and skilled as she tended her father's wounds. He remembered Joseph's words about wounded warriors helping each other, the dignity and wisdom in his weathered face. These weren't the behaviors of ruthless raiders who would shoot an unarmed rancher in cold blood. "This rancher Hutchins," Billy said carefully, "does he see them actually take in cattle?" Carter reined in his horse suddenly, turning to face Billy with obvious irritation. "Morrison, you're asking a lot of questions for a man who's supposed to be helping us track fugitives." The challenge was direct and dangerous. Billy realized he'd been probing too obviously, allowing his doubts about the situation to color his questions. But he was committed now, and retreat would only increase suspicion. "Just trying to understand what we're up against," Billy said. "Evenly, if these are hardened raiders, that's one thing. If they're desperate people who made a bad choice, that's something else. Does it matter?" The bounty hunter asked with a cold smile. $50 for information, 100 for capture. Dead or alive, the money's the same. Billy felt something harden in his chest at the casual mention of killing. These men weren't just interested in justice. They were motivated by profit, by the territorial bounty on Apache raiders. In their minds, Maria and Joseph had already been tried and convicted. The actual facts of the case were secondary to the reward money. "It matters to me," Billy said quietly. "I was a soldier for 12 years. I know the difference between enemy combatants and refugees." Sergeant Kowalski turned in his saddle to look at Billy directly. "And which do you think we're chasing, soldier?" Billy met his gaze steadily. "I think we're chasing two people who are probably more scared than dangerous. I think the woman is trying to keep her father alive, and I think they'd surrender peacefully if they believed they'd get a fair hearing." Carter had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. "Well, you're about to find out," he said, pointing ahead into the darkness. "Because those tracks you mentioned better be real, and they better lead us to our fugitives." They had reached the area Billy had indicated, a stretch of broken ground near the entrance to the old Spanish mines. Billy dismounted and began searching for signs of passage, using his knowledge of tracking to create believable false evidence while appearing to follow genuine traces. "Here," he announced, kneeling beside a patch of soft earth. "Definitely two people, one of them dragging his feet like he's injured." Billy had learned basic tracking in the army, and he applied those skills now to construct a convincing fiction. Headed up toward the mine entrance, the bounty hunter produced a powerful lantern and began examining the supposed tracks more closely. Billy held his breath, hoping his hasty fabrication would withstand scrutiny from a professional tracker. After several tense minutes, the man nodded. "Could be them," he agreed. "Hard to tell for sure in this light, but the size is about right." Carter organized his men for a systematic search of the Spanish mines, assigning each person a section to explore while keeping one man posted as a lookout. Billy found himself paired with Sergeant Kowalski, exploring a tunnel that penetrated deep into the hillside before branching into multiple passages. As they worked their way through the abandoned workings, Billy became increasingly aware that his deception couldn't last much longer. The Spanish mines were genuinely empty, showing no signs of recent habitation. Eventually, Carter would realize they were following a false trail and would expand the search back toward the area where Maria and Joseph were actually hiding. But something unexpected happened as they explored the deepest section of the mine. Kowalski, who had been maintaining a professional but distant attitude, suddenly stopped and turned to face Billy directly. "I know who you are," the sergeant said. Quietly, Billy felt his heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "Captain William Morrison, formerly of the 4th Cavalry Regiment. You were at the Battle of Turret Mountain in '87. I was a corporal then, part of the relief column that found your unit after the Apache ambush." Billy stared at the sergeant in the flickering lantern light, memory suddenly flooding back. Turret Mountain had been a disaster, an entire cavalry patrol caught in a canyon and nearly wiped out by Apache warriors who knew the terrain better than the soldiers did. Billy had been a young lieutenant then, responsible for getting his men out of an impossible situation. "I remember," Billy said slowly. "You were with Captain Rodriguez's company." Kowalski nodded. "You saved a lot of lives that day, sir." "Organized the defense, got the wounded to safety, held off the attack until we could reach you." He paused meaningfully. "Lot of us figured you for a medal, maybe even a promotion. Instead, I got transferred to ammunition depot duty," Billy said with bitter humor. Apparently, surviving an ambush doesn't always look good on a service record. "No, sir, it doesn't," Kowalski agreed. "But it looks good to the men whose lives you saved." He studied Billy's bandaged face carefully. "Heard about what happened at Fort Huachuca. Heard you were pretty badly hurt." Billy felt exposed under the sergeant's knowing gaze. This man had seen him in action, knew what kind of officer he'd been before the explosion changed everything. The professional respect in Kowalski's voice was both comforting and painful, reminding Billy of a version of himself he'd thought was lost forever. "I'm not the same man I was then," Billy said quietly. "Maybe not," Kowalski admitted. "But you're still the man who walked into Apache territory at night to help with a search. Still the man who knows right from wrong." He lowered his voice further. "Question is, Captain, what exactly are we searching for out here?" The moment of truth had arrived, and Billy realized he was facing a choice that would define not just the immediate situation, but his understanding of himself. He could continue the deception, maintain his cover story, and hope to buy more time for Maria and Joseph. Or he could trust in the respect of a fellow soldier and tell the truth to someone who might understand the complexities of honor and duty. Billy looked into Kowalski's weathered face and made his decision. "We're searching for two innocent people," he said quietly. "A woman trying to keep her wounded father alive, and an old man who never stole any cattle or shot any ranchers." Kowalski was silent for a long moment, processing this admission. You know where they are? Yes. And you've been leading us away from them? Yes. Kowalski nodded slowly, as if Billy's answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. Why? Billy chose his words carefully, knowing that everything depended on making this career soldier understand the moral dimensions of the situation. Because sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, Sergeant. And sometimes a soldier's real duty isn't to follow orders, it's to protect the innocent, even when protecting them puts you at risk. Kowalski studied Billy's face for another long moment, then surprised him by extending his hand. Then I guess we better figure out how to get them to safety, sir, he said quietly. Because you're right, sometimes being a soldier means doing what's right instead of what's easy. In the depths of an abandoned mine, surrounded by the tools of deception and pursuit, two old soldiers had found a moment of truth that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. Billy felt something lift from his shoulders as he shook Kowalski's hand, the burden of carrying this secret alone, and more importantly, the fear that his scars had somehow changed who he fundamentally was. He was still Captain William Morrison, still a man who protected the innocent and made hard choices in impossible situations. The bandages covering his face were just cloth and medicine. The man underneath remained unchanged. Kowalski's alliance changed everything, but it also complicated their situation immeasurably. They now had to extract Maria and Joseph from the hidden mine without alerting Carter and the bounty hunter, who were growing increasingly suspicious about the lack of evidence in the Spanish workings. Time was running short, and Billy could hear Carter's voice echoing through the tunnels, demanding answers about the cold trail they'd been following. How long before they figure out we've been chasing shadows? Billy asked as he and Kowalski made their way back toward the main group. Carter's not stupid, Kowalski replied quietly. Maybe another hour before he realizes the tracks don't lead anywhere real. After that, he'll expand the search pattern, and those dynamite charges will start opening up every blocked passage in a 5-mile radius. They emerged from the tunnel to find Carter in heated discussion with the bounty hunter, both men gesturing angrily toward the empty mine shafts they'd been exploring. The third man, a territorial ranger named Phillips, was examining what appeared to be genuine Apache tracks, but these were old, probably weeks or months old, left by travelers who had long since moved on. Morrison, Carter called sharply, your tracks are leading us nowhere. Either you're a worse tracker than I thought, or someone's been feeding us false information. Billy felt Kowalski's subtle touch on his arm, a warning to be careful with. His response: Carter was clearly suspicious now, and any misstep could trigger a confrontation that would end badly for everyone involved. Maybe I was wrong about what I saw, Billy said, attempting to project disappointment rather than deception. It was dark when I found those marks, and I could have misread the signs. The bounty hunter, whose name Billy still didn't know, stepped forward with obvious hostility. Or maybe you've been deliberately wasting our time while your Apache friends put more distance between us and them. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Carter's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, and Billy realized they'd reached the moment where words alone wouldn't be sufficient to defuse the situation. These men had ridden hard through the night, following what they now suspected was a false trail, and their patience was exhausted. But before Billy could respond, a new voice cut through the tension from somewhere above them in the darkness. Deputy Carter, this is Maria Running Bear. I want to talk. Everyone froze, weapons half drawn, as Maria's clear voice echoed off the canyon walls. Billy's heart sank as he realized she'd left the safety of the hidden mine, probably to prevent him from facing the consequences of harboring her and her father alone. It was exactly the kind of selfless decision he might have made in her position, and exactly the outcome he'd been trying to prevent. Show yourself, Carter called back, his rifle now fully raised. Hands where we can see them. Maria appeared on a rocky ledge about 30 feet above them, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Her hands were indeed visible, raised peacefully, but Billy noted she'd positioned herself where the terrain would make it difficult for the armed men below to get a clear shot if the situation deteriorated. "I am alone," she announced. "My father is injured, cannot travel. We surrender, but I want to speak the truth before you arrest us." The bounty hunter trained his rifle on her immediately. "Come down slow and keep those hands up." "First you listen," Maria replied firmly. "Then I come down. But you listen to truth about what happened at Hutchins Ranch." Carter lowered his weapon slightly, apparently recognizing that a talking suspect was preferable to a shooting one. "Go ahead, tell us your version." Maria's voice carried clearly in the still night air as she began to speak. "My father and we traveled to Tucson to sell beadwork, buy supplies for winter. We stop at a creek near Hutchins' place to water horses and rest. 3 white men come, say we steal cattle. We have no cattle, never steal cattle, but they say we lie." Billy listened intently, finally hearing the other side of the story that had made Maria and Joseph into fugitives. Around him, the armed men remained tense but attentive, weapons ready but not actively aimed. "They point guns at us, say they take us to sheriff, get reward money," Maria continued. "My father, he tried to explain that we are innocent. He show papers from Indian agent, show beadwork we sell, show we have money to buy supplies. But they don't listen." "What about the shooting?" Carter called. "Hutchins was shot, woman. That's a fact." Maria was quiet for a moment before responding, and when she did, her voice carried a weight of sadness that cut through the night air. "Hutchins not shot by us," she said simply. "Hutchins shot by his own men when he tried to stop them from hanging. My father." The words landed like physical blows among the search party. Billy saw Carter's expression change from suspicion to uncertainty, while Kowalski's face grew grim with understanding. Even the bounty hunter seemed taken aback by the accusation. "That's a hell of a claim," Carter said carefully. "You got any proof? Hutchins is still alive, yes? Ask him what really happened. Ask him why he tried to stop them. Ask him who fired the shot that wound him." Maria's voice grew stronger. "Better yet, ask why 3 men chased 2 Apache with no cattle, no stolen goods, nothing but beadwork and legal papers." Billy felt pieces of a larger picture falling into place. The wounded rancher hadn't been shot during a cattle theft. He'd been shot trying to prevent a lynching. The 3 men who had pursued Maria and Joseph hadn't been retrieving stolen property. They'd been covering up their own attempted murder of innocent travelers. Where are these 3 men now? Kowalski called up to Maria. "Don't know." "When shooting start, we run. When father gets shot, we keep running." Maria's silhouette shifted slightly on the ledge. "We think they follow us, but they probably go back to Hutchins, make up story about Apache raiders to cover what they really do." Carter holstered his weapon and stepped forward. "Maria Running Bear, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of cattle theft and assault. But I'm also going to investigate your claims about what happened at the Hutchins Ranch." "Investigation after arrest?" Maria asked. "Or investigation to find truth?" It was a pointed question that highlighted the difference between territorial justice and actual justice. Carter seemed to recognize the distinction, and when he responded, his voice carried less certainty than it had earlier. "Investigation too. Find the truth," he said finally. "But you still need to come down here, and you need to tell us where your father is." Billy stepped forward, knowing this was his moment to reveal his role without compromising Maria's safety. "She doesn't need to tell you where he is, Deputy. I can show you." All eyes turned to Billy, and he saw understanding dawn on Carter's face. "You've been harboring them." "I've been providing medical aid to a wounded man and his daughter," Billy corrected. "Same as any decent person would do when they found someone bleeding to death by a creek." The bounty hunter swung his rifle toward Billy. That makes you an accessory to cattle theft and assault. No, Kowalski interjected, his voice carrying military authority. That makes him a good Samaritan who helped injured people. He looked directly at Carter. And if the woman's story is true, then we've been chasing the wrong people while the real criminals are back in town spinning tailies about Apache raiders. Carter absorbed this possibility with obvious discomfort. If Maria's account was accurate, then his search party had been manipulated into pursuing innocent victims while allowing the actual perpetrators to escape justice. It was exactly the kind of territorial politics and racial prejudice that made law enforcement in Apache country so complicated. "All right," Carter said finally. "Morrison, you take us to the injured man. Mrs. Running Bear, you come down slowly and join us. We're going to sort this out, but we're doing it by the book." Billy felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as Maria carefully picked her way down from the rocky ledge. The immediate crisis had passed, but they were far from a complete resolution. Joseph was still seriously wounded. Maria and her father were still technically under arrest, and Billy was still facing potential charges for harboring fugitives. But something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between the searchers and the searched. Carter was now asking questions instead of simply pursuing capture, and Kowalski's military experience lent credibility to the possibility that innocent people had been wrongly accused. The group made its way back toward the hidden mine in an atmosphere of cautious cooperation rather than hostile pursuit. Billy led the way, with Maria walking freely but under guard, while Carter and his remaining men followed with weapons lowered but ready. As they approached the mine entrance, Billy called out softly in the few Apache words he'd learned during his fort service, announcing their approach and Maria's safety. Joseph's voice answered from within, weak but alert, and Billy felt a surge of relief that the wounded man had survived the night. Inside the mine, the confrontation Billy had been dreading transformed into something more resembling a medical consultation. Joseph Running Bear lay propped against the stone wall, obviously in pain but conscious and dignified. Carter knelt beside him, examining the bandaged wounds with the practical eye of a man who'd seen plenty of violence. "These are bullet wounds," Carter observed. "Yes," Joseph replied in clear English, surprising everyone except Maria and Billy. "Shot by 3 white men near Hutchins Ranch. They say we steal cattle. We have no cattle." Carter looked from Joseph to Maria, then to Billy. "You treated these wounds?" "Maria did most of the work," Billy said honestly. "She knows more about healing than I do. I just provided supplies and a safe place." Kowalski had been examining the makeshift medical supplies, noting the clean bandages and the careful way Joseph's wounds had been dressed. "Professional work," he commented. "Someone with real medical training did this. Apache women learn healing." Maria explained. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She teach me plants, teach me surgery, teach me how to help people live when others say they die." The bounty hunter, who had remained silent during most of this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the fact that these people are wanted for crimes. And Morrison here has been obstructing a federal investigation." But Carter raised a hand to silence him. "Actually, it changes everything." He looked directly at Joseph. "If what you're telling me is true, then Pete Hutchins was shot trying to protect you from being lynched. That makes this an entirely different kind of case." Joseph nodded slowly. "Hutchins, good man. He see 3 men put rope around a tree. See them force me to stand under it. He say, no, this is not right. These people have papers. They do not steal anything. Men get angry, say he is soft on Apache, say he is a traitor to his own kind." Joseph's voice grew heavy with memory. "When he try to cut the rope, they shoot him. Accident, maybe or maybe not. But they shoot him, then blame us." Billy watched Carter's face as he processed this information, seeing the deputy marshal work. through the implications of what he was hearing. If Joseph's account was accurate, then the entire foundation of their manhunt was false. They'd been pursuing victims rather than perpetrators, and the real criminals were probably back in their home territory, safe behind a wall of fabricated evidence and racial prejudice. "I need to send a telegram to Tombstone," Carter said finally. "Have them re-interview Hutchins, check his story against what you've told me." He looked at Billy. "And I need to decide what to do about you, Morrison. Technically, you've interfered with a federal investigation." Billy straightened, preparing to accept whatever consequences his choices had earned. "I understand, Deputy. I made my decision knowing the risks." But Kowalski stepped forward before Carter could continue. "With respect, sir, I think Morrison's actions show exactly the kind of judgment we want from citizens. He provided medical aid to wounded people and gathered information about their situation before taking action. That's not obstruction. That's good police work." Carter considered this perspective, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he made a decision that surprised everyone. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced. "Morrison, you're going to help us get this man to a real doctor in Tombstone. Mrs. Running Bear, you and your father are going to remain in protective custody while we investigate your claims. And if your story checks out, if Hutchins confirms what you've told me, then we're going to have a very different conversation about who the real criminals are in this case." Billy felt something loosen in his chest as he realized the immediate danger had passed. They weren't out of trouble yet, but they were no longer fugitives fleeing from certain capture. They were witnesses in a case that might actually lead to justice rather than simple vengeance. As they prepared Joseph for the difficult journey to medical care, Billy found himself working alongside Maria and Kowalski to create a more comfortable transport. The bounty hunter stood apart, clearly disappointed by the turn of events, but Carter's authority kept him from interfering. "You did the right thing," Joseph said quietly to Billy as they lifted him onto the improvised stretcher. "You see people in need, you help. That's what good people do." Billy adjusted his bandages unconsciously, then realized what he'd done. For the first time in 18 months, the gesture felt like a habit rather than an attempt to hide. These people had seen his scars, seen his damaged face, and had judged him not by his appearance, but by his actions. "Thank you," Billy said simply, "both of you, for trusting me." Maria smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Billy had seen on her face since finding her by the creek. "You remind us that not all healing comes from medicine," she said. "Sometimes healing comes from one person choosing to see another person as a human being worth helping." As they began the careful journey toward Tombstone and whatever resolution awaited them there, Billy realized that Maria was right about healing. His scars would always be with him, and the bandages might never come off completely. But the deeper wound, the one that had convinced him he was forever separate from the rest of humanity, had begun to close the moment he decided to help rather than hide. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Billy was no longer walking it alone. 3 months later, Billy Morrison stood before the mirror in his cabin for the first time since the explosion. The bandages lay in neat strips on the table beside him, freshly changed but not yet re-wrapped around his scarred face. The reflection that stared back was still shocking. Twisted skin, missing patches of hair, features that would never again be called handsome by any conventional measure. But the eyes looking back at him were different now. Not the hollow, defeated eyes of a man in hiding, but the clear gaze of someone who had rediscovered his purpose. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined the entirety of who he was. A soft knock at the door interrupted his examination. Billy quickly rewrapped his face, leaving only his eyes visible, and called for his visitor to enter. Maria stepped through the doorway carrying a basket of what smelled like fresh bread and stew, her winter coat dusted with snow from the early November storm that had blown through the territory. "How is the patient today?" she asked with a smile. Setting the basket on his table, "Restless," Billy admitted. Dr. Patterson says Joseph's wounds are healing well, but he's not used to being confined to bed. Maria laughed, a sound that had become familiar and comforting over the past months. Father is never good at staying still. Even as a young man, my mother say he is always moving, always working, always finding something to do with his hands. Joseph. Running Bear had spent 6 weeks in the Tombstone Hospital, recovering from surgery to remove the bullet that had lodged near his ribs. The operation had been successful, but the healing process was slow, complicated by infection and his age. When Dr. Patterson had finally cleared him for discharge, Billy had invited both Joseph and Maria to stay at his homestead while the older man regained his strength. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just until Joseph could travel safely. That had been 5 weeks ago. Maria, Billy said, settling into one of the wooden chairs, you don't have to keep bringing food. I'm perfectly capable of cooking for myself. I know, she replied, beginning to unpack the basket. But Apache women, we show care through feeding people. And besides, your cooking's still terrible. Billy found himself smiling beneath his bandages. Maria's direct honesty had been startling at first, but he'd come to appreciate the way she spoke without the careful politeness most people used around his injuries. She treated him like a complete person rather than a damaged one, and that made all the difference. Any word from Deputy Carter about the trial? Billy asked. Maria's expression grew more serious. He stopped by yesterday while you were in town. The 3 men finally arrest them. Hutchins tells the truth about what happened at his ranch. Say he remember everything now, say he testify against them. The investigation into the shooting had taken months to complete, complicated by the initial false reports and the need to track down witnesses. But eventually, Pete Hutchins had recovered enough to give his full account of what had happened, confirming Joseph and Maria's version of events in every detail. The 3 men who had attacked them, drifters looking to collect bounty money on Apache scalps, were now facing charges of attempted murder, assault, and filing false reports. More importantly, the territorial government had been forced to confront the reality that innocent Apache families were being targeted by bounty hunters who saw them as easy prey. Will you have to testify? Billy asked. Maybe. Carter said probably. Not, because Hutchins saw everything and he white man, so his word carry more weight with the judge. Maria's tone carried no bitterness at this observation, just matter-of-fact acceptance of how territorial justice worked. But we stay until the trial finished, make sure justice really happened. Billy nodded, understanding the caution behind that decision. Justice for Apache people in territorial courts was never guaranteed, even with white witnesses and clear evidence. But the case had attracted attention from newspapers and reformers, making it harder for local authorities to simply ignore or dismiss. The cabin door opened again, and Joseph Running Bear entered, moving slowly but steadily with the aid of a carved walking stick. His recovery had been remarkable for a man his age, testament to both his inherent toughness and Maria's skilled nursing care. Billy, Joseph said, settling carefully into the remaining chair, we need to talk. There was something formal in his tone that made Billy pay closer attention. Over the months they'd lived together, Joseph had become more than a patient or a houseguest. He'd become something Billy had never expected to have again, a friend. And more than that, a mentor who understood the complexities of carrying visible wounds in a world that preferred its heroes unmarked. What's on your mind? Billy asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment, looking around the cabin that had become home to all 3 of them. Maria and I, we are grateful for everything you do. You save our lives. You give us a place to heal. You risk everything to help strangers. You don't need to thank me again, Billy interrupted. We've been through this. Not thanks, Joseph said firmly. Question. What do you do when the trial is over? When we leave, what happened to Billy Morrison? The question hung in the air between them, touching on something Billy had been avoiding thinking about. Eventually, Joseph would be strong enough to travel, and he and Maria would return to their own lives. The cabin would become quiet again, empty except for Billy's carefully ordered solitude. But the prospect no longer held the same appeal it once had. 3 months of shared meals, evening conversations, and collaborative daily routines had reminded Billy what it meant to be part of something larger than his own injuries and fears. "I suppose I'll go back to the way things were," Billy said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "That would be a waste," Joseph observed bluntly. "You are good at helping people, good at making hard decisions, good at seeing truth when others see only fear." He gestured toward his healing wounds. "You have a gift for healing, not just bodies but situations. Why do you hide a gift?" Billy felt exposed by the observation. "I'm not hiding anything. I just prefer privacy." "Privacy is different from hiding," Maria interjected gently. "Privacy means you choose when to be with people. Hiding means you're afraid to be with people." The distinction was uncomfortably accurate. Billy had told himself he was choosing isolation. But the truth was that he'd been afraid. Afraid of stares, afraid of pity, afraid of being seen as something broken and pitiful. "Maybe hiding is safer," Billy said. "Safer for who?" Joseph asked. "Safer for you, maybe. But what about people who need help? What about the next person like us, hurt and scared and needing someone who understands what it means to carry wounds?" Billy absorbed this challenge, recognizing the deeper question Joseph was asking. Was his isolation ultimately selfish? Was he denying help to others because facing the world felt too difficult for him personally? "There's a place you should see," Maria said suddenly, as if making a decision. "Something we want to show you before we leave." The next morning, despite the cold November wind, the three of them rode north toward the reservation lands where Maria and Joseph had family. Billy hadn't been this far from his homestead since before the explosion, and he felt increasingly nervous as they encountered other travelers on the main trail. But something unexpected happened during those encounters. Instead of the stares and whispered comments he'd feared, most people simply nodded politely and continued on their way. A few asked directions or commented on the weather. One elderly rancher even thanked Billy for his military service after noticing the way he carried himself in the saddle. "People do not stare at you like you think they do," Maria observed as they rode. "Most people, they see a bandaged face, and they think injured man or veteran, not monster like you fear." Billy realized she was right. His own self-consciousness had magnified every glance into a stare, every moment of silence into judgment. The reality was far more mundane and far less hostile than his fears had painted it. Their destination turned out to be a small settlement on the edge of the reservation, a collection of adobe buildings and traditional Apache dwellings, where about 50 families had created a community that blended old ways with new necessities. It was neither the primitive camp Billy had expected, nor the fully assimilated town some government officials envisioned, but something entirely its own. "This is where we live when not traveling," Joseph explained as they dismounted near the Fayette Central area. "Mixed community, Apache families, few white families, some Mexican families. People who want to live peaceful, raise children, and make an honest living." Billy looked around at the settlement, noting the obvious signs of prosperity and organization. Gardens, workshops, a small school building, even what appeared to be a medical clinic. It wasn't the struggling reservation community he'd heard described in town, but a thriving example of what was possible when people were allowed to build rather than simply survive. "We have a problem though," Maria said, leading Billy toward the clinic building. "Doctor who helped us, he gets sick last month. Have to go back east for treatment. Now we have no one with medical training, and winter is coming." Billy began to understand why they'd brought him here. Inside the clinic, he found a well-equipped medical facility with supplies, instruments, and even a small library of medical texts. Everything needed to provide healthcare to the community, except for someone trained to use it all. "You want me to work here?" Billy asked. "We want you to think about it," Joseph replied. "You have medical training from the army. You have good judgment. You understand how to help people without making them feel shame about needing help." He gestured around the clinic. "These families, they need a doctor. But more than that, they need a doctor who understands what it means to be different, to carry marks that make other people uncomfortable." Billy walked through the clinic, examining the equipment and supplies. It was better equipped than many military field hospitals he'd seen, and the location would serve not just the reservation community, but isolated ranchers and travelers throughout the region. "I'm not a real doctor," Billy pointed out. "I just have field training." "Real enough," Maria said. "And we have traditional healers who know plants, know setting bones, know birthing babies. You work with them, they work with you, everyone learns." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and appealing. It would mean leaving his isolated homestead, living among people, being seen and potentially judged by strangers every day. But it would also mean using his skills to help people who genuinely needed medical care, working alongside healers like Maria, who understood medicine as a calling rather than just a profession. Over the next several hours, Billy met members of the community, Apache families, white settlers who'd chosen to live peacefully alongside their neighbors, Mexican immigrants who'd found acceptance here that was denied elsewhere. What struck him most was how naturally they interacted with his bandaged face, treating it as simply another fact about him, rather than the defining characteristic of his identity. By evening, when they prepared to return to his homestead, Billy found himself seriously considering the possibility. Not just the job, but the life it would represent, a life of engagement rather than isolation, of service rather than self-protection. "I need time to think," Billy told Joseph as they rode back through the darkness. "Of course," Joseph agreed. "But remember, thinking and hiding, they're not the same thing. Thinking means you consider all possibilities. Hiding means you have already decided you're not worthy of possibilities." Back at his cabin, Billy sat up late into the night, staring into the fire and weighing his options. He could remain safe in his isolation, protected from stares and judgment, but also cut off from purpose and connection. Or he could accept the risk of being seen, of being judged, in exchange for the opportunity to help people who needed his skills. When morning came, Billy Morrison made his decision. He packed his medical supplies, his books, and the few possessions that mattered to him. Then he wrote a letter to Deputy Carter, offering his services as a consulting medical examiner for difficult cases. Finally, he saddled his horse and rode north toward a community that had offered him something he'd thought was lost forever, the chance to be useful. 6 months later, Dr. William Morrison, as the community had begun calling him, delivered his first baby, a healthy Apache girl whose mother had been told by white doctors in Tucson that her pregnancy was too dangerous to survive. Working with Maria's traditional knowledge of birthing practices, Billy had successfully managed a difficult delivery that saved both mother and child. The bandages were still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but they no longer defined him. Instead, Billy had become known as the doctor who understood pain, the healer who never judged people for their wounds, the man who proved that scars were just evidence of surviving something difficult. And late at night, when he sat by his fire, reading poetry or medical journals, Billy Morrison sometimes allowed himself to smile beneath his bandages. Not because his face had healed, it never would, not completely, but because he had finally learned the difference between being marked by tragedy and being defined by it. The Apache healer had shown him true beauty after all, not the beauty of unmarked skin or perfect features, but the beauty of a life spent helping others carry their burdens. It was a different kind of beauty than he'd once possessed, but it was deeper and more lasting. And it belonged entirely to the man he had chosen to become, rather than the man he had accidentally been before. In the end, that had made all the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.